Hi, this is Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and today we're going to be talking about the problems you can run into when growing food in containers. We grow a lot of food in containers and know all about those problems, so we're going to talk about them and what you can do about them. As always, if you like our content, we'd love it if you gave us a like and subscribe, but if not, that's cool too. Let's get started. Growing food in containers is an extremely popular technique. A lot of people want to try to get into it. We heavily practice container gardening because where we're growing here in the subarctic, it helps us promote warmer soils, and this benefits our plants in our cold climate. But you can pretty much grow any kind of plant that you would like in a container, and most will grow just fine. That is if you can deal with the challenges. We grow several hundred plants every year in containers, and so we're pretty well versed in the kinds of issues you can run into. While container gardening is an excellent gardening technique, it does have a number of challenges that are associated with it. It's not necessarily considered easy gardening. We're going to talk about some of the issues that you can run into and some of the cheap and inexpensive solutions that we've come up with in order to deal with those challenges in our container gardens. One of the most significant problems with container gardening is maintaining a proper water supply. Containers are limited in the amount of soil and thus the water that they have within them, and thus it's an extremely common situation for the plants to run out of all the water that's available in their plants. This can end up causing drought conditions, which is highly problematic, especially for plants like tomatoes that need constant access to moisture while they're growing. Some of the best solutions for watering your container gardens include drip irrigation, sub-irrigation, using larger containers, and what are called drip pans. Since this is the most common problem that most container gardeners run into, we're going to go through each one of those solutions one by one and talk about them in more depth. Drip irrigation is an incredibly popular method for solving some of the container gardening watering woes. It's the solution we use in our deck flower gardens here since those flowers are grown in containers. And basically what it involves is using irrigation hose to bring the water to your plants, and then you use drip emitters, soaker hose, or drip line in order to drip the water into the actual soil. And how this technique works is it applies water to the soil more slowly, which allows it to absorb that moisture in a much more rapid fashion compared to just blasting it with a hose, where honestly most of the water actually just drips through into the ground. So this is a really effective technique, and it can be used in both on-grid and off-grid solutions, typically with off-grid requiring a pump to deliver the water into the drip emitters or other soaker hose that you might be using. Sub-irrigation is another method you can use to greatly solve the watering problems in container gardens. While it's a little lesser used, it's one that we really like in our gardens. In fact, what's going on behind me here in all of our food-focused container gardens is sub-irrigation. It's an extremely effective technique, and the very basics of it is that there's a reservoir of water underneath the soil, and that water absorbs into the soil. And why it's really effective is, one, there's a reservoir of water that it can use to constantly keep the soil moist, and two, it almost eliminates drought conditions since it doesn't require watering nearly as frequently. We love sub-irrigation because it's extremely water efficient, and that's why we heavily use it in our off-grid gardens. Using water pans is another possible technique that you can use to help with your watering woes in your container garden. We used to heavily use watering pans when we were using fabric pots like what I have behind me here before we switched over to sub-irrigation. And basically a watering pan is a little plastic pan that you put underneath your fabric or plastic pot, and it captures a little bit of the excess water that is given to your plants. This water can then be reabsorbed into the soil at a later time, which basically allows you to get away with a little bit less watering overall. While it's not a surefire technique, it does give you a little bit of extra time, and it's a helpful thing to have in a container garden. One of the very best possible solutions that you can use, though, is to give your containers more soil. A lot of container gardeners have a tendency to underestimate the amount of soil that their plants can require. And when you run into that situation where your plants are going through the water very quickly, it's a surefire sign every single time that your container is actually undersized. It's not uncommon for container plants to need 7 or even 10 gallons, sometimes more, in order to properly go into the soil and have have enough moisture there for its own needs. So if you're running into that problem where you're running out of water in your container grown plants very quickly, it's a surefire sign that you don't have enough soil in your container garden. And while it may not be easy to fix this season, it is a note you should make for the following season and try to correct it then. One of the next biggest issues for container gardens is the efficiency of its water use. Whether it's overspray or water just draining through the bottom of the container or evaporation that occurs naturally, container gardens are extremely inefficient in their use of water. The statistics I've read estimate that about 50% of any water applied to a container garden is lost to one of those three methods. And therefore, if you live in an area where water costs you a lot of money, or if you're gardening off grid like we are, that water efficiency is a big, big deal. The good news is that all of the solutions that we talked about for maintaining a proper watering in your container garden are also solutions that will increase the water efficiency of your container garden. Just to go through those quickly again, that was drip irrigation, sub-irrigation, watering pans, and the use of larger containers. All of those will allow more water to be retained and used effectively, with sub-irrigation probably providing the most efficiency that you can possibly achieve. In sub-irrigation, it's generally estimated that you use between 99.5 and 100% of any water that's applied to the garden. And really, your only risk of losing water is from evaporation. One of the other major problems you can run into with container gardens is not providing enough soil for your plants. This is similar to what we talked about earlier, but it can involve not having enough depth of soil for your plants, say for a root vegetable like carrots, but it can also be for a large plant and not providing enough soil. This can cause a number of different issues, the biggest of which is that not having enough soil can actually hold back the growth of your plant. Once your plant's roots have expanded to the capacity of that soil, the plant is pretty much done growing, as it can no longer maintain any further growth going forward. Also, this can exacerbate water availability issues and cause drought conditions like we talked about earlier. So it's always important to right size your containers that you use in a container gardening solution. You're probably starting to notice a theme here, but the solution in this case is to use larger containers. We're going to give you some general guidelines that we use for our container gardens. And basically, for very small plants, usually in a single quantity, you want to start with containers that are in the 2 to 3 gallon range. For medium-sized plants, something like your peppers and things like that, usually you want to be in the 5 to 7 gallon range. For very large plants, such as tomatoes, and especially those that are sensitive to drought conditions, you want to look at 7 to 10 gallons and sometimes even more. Ultimately, the more soil that you use, the more water your plants are going to have access to, and the less problems overall you're going to have in your container garden. Again, a lot of gardeners do undersize their soil needs, and really using more is the right solution. One of the next biggest problems you can run into with container gardens is overheating of those gardens. This is especially problematic in warmer climates, but it can be a problem really anywhere. And basically, because of the reason that we're using containers in order to increase soil temperatures, that happens whether you're in a warm climate or a cold climate, and there is such a thing as plants getting too hot. This can be especially problematic, and it can cause a number of different issues to affect your plants. So we're going to talk about some of the solutions you can use for that. So one of the best possible solutions you can use to help avoid overheating your container garden is to use lighter containers. So we use black containers because it helps absorb the heat from the sun, but if you use a lighter color, it's going to reflect more of that heat. Another technique you can use is to bury your containers, although this starts to get into the question of why don't you just grow in the ground to begin with, right? And so that's certainly a viable critique of that. But another thing you can do is to try to ensure more shade into your garden. So this is often used in warmer climate areas anyway, and ultimately shading your plants and shading your containers is going to help cool them down and reduce the overall heat load that is in the containers themselves. Another common issue that container gardeners run into is a lack of general nutrition. So just like with our water availability issues, it's very possible for a plant to exhaust all of the nutrients that are available in the container garden soil. This is especially problematic with large plants like tomatoes, where those roots can take up the entire soil that is available to them and exhaust all of the nutrients. And this can ultimately create a nutritional deficiency that has to be corrected by the gardener. The best solution to this, obviously, is regular applications of fertilizer. We really like using water-soluble fertilizers and regular, almost weekly applications of that on our container gardens because it ensures a constant availability of nutrition. You can also use granular fertilizers infused into the soil when you build your container garden, and this allows you a very long-term approach and typically long-term access to nutrients. But it's always important when you're container gardening to be on the lookout for nutritional deficiencies, as it can be an early sign that your plants have exhausted the available nutrition and it needs to be supplemented further. A number of common container gardening issues can come from the selection of a poor location for your garden. Container gardening really allows you to garden anywhere, but there are such things as a good and bad location. In general, you want your container garden to get between 8 and 12 hours of sunlight every day, and you can think of that in terms of morning sunlight, afternoon sunlight, and evening sunlight as being sufficient, again with the target of being 8 to 12 hours every day. If you've selected a poor location, fortunately, the solution is very easy. Just select a better location for it, one that will get adequate amounts of sunlight every single day. A number of different problems can come from trying to grow too many plants in a container. Growing intensively in containers is what I would consider an advanced gardening technique. It takes a lot of care to be paid to the soil nutrition and general fertilization strategy that you use in your container garden, and therefore it's not for everyone. But ultimately, you can easily exhaust the nutrition available in containers if you're not paying attention to it. Also, it's really important if you're growing multiple plants that they have similar water uptake needs. So this is where we practice most of our containers. All of them are the same plants that are growing in the containers, and the only time we really change that is in our flower gardens where we grow lots of different kinds of flowers. But there we generally have a lot of experience and practice with growing those different kinds of plants, and so we can be sure that they have similar water uptake needs. If they have different water uptake needs, what can happen is one plant can take all of the water away from all of the plants, and therefore you get a drought condition from that one plant that ultimately causes a drought for all of your plants. Fortunately, overwatering is not a very common problem to see with container gardening, but it is something that can happen. With your containers, you generally want to make sure that you have appropriate drains on your container garden that allows any excess rainfall or water that you've applied to the garden to escape appropriately. It is possible to drown your plants, especially if you don't have any drains. Also, you want to make sure that you're using a generally well-draining soil. Like typical potting soil is a good choice for most gardeners because it will drain exceptionally well and it won't compact and contain a lot of water that puts your plants at risk of overwatering. Those are the big ones, and there are a few other issues that you can run into with container gardens, but fortunately they're a lot less common. And this video's gotten long enough, so we're going to end it there. Once again, I'm Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and I'd like to thank you for watching. If you liked our content, we'd love it if you gave us a like and subscribe, but if you don't, that's cool too. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and put them down below and we'll try to get back to you on them. Once again, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.